Take the money and leave Bernie. You are embarrassing us. That is what my son-in-law's father, Richard Kensington, told me as he slid a check for $10,000 across his mahogany desk. He looked at my worn-out work boots and shook his head in disgust. He thought he was paying off a poor retired mechanic to stay away from his wealthy family. He thought he was buying my silence and my absence because I was a stain on his perfect image. What Richard did not know was that the check he just signed was drawn from a bank account that exists only because I allow it to. He did not know that I am the Atlas Trust. He did not know that I own 51% of his entire empire, and he certainly did not know that in exactly 48 hours, I was going to take it all back. Before I tell you how I destroyed a dynasty, with a single signature, hit that like button and subscribe. If you have ever been underestimated by people who think money equals class, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. It all started on a Saturday afternoon that was supposed to be a celebration. My son-in-law Preston was turning 32, and my daughter Emily had invited me to their estate in the Hamptons. I remember the drive vividly. My 2005 Ford F-150 has a loose muffler that rattles like a bag of marbles whenever I go over 40 miles an hour. It is a good truck. It has hauled timber, steel, and machinery for 2 decades, but against the pristine, manicured hedges of the Kensington estate, it looked like a rust bucket from a scrapyard. I pulled up to the main gate, and before I could even roll down my window, a security guard in a uniform that cost more than my entire wardrobe stepped out. He did not ask for my name. He did not ask for my invitation. He just tapped his baton on the hood of my truck. That sound, a sharp metallic clack, echoed in the silence of the afternoon. He told me deliveries were around the back and that I was leaking oil on the private drive. I tried to explain that I was Preston's father-in-law, but he just left. He looked at my flannel shirt and my calloused hands and told me to turn around before he called the police. I was about to reach for my phone to call my lawyer, Jerome, but then I saw her. Emily came running down the long driveway. She was not running to greet me. She was running to stop a scene. My little girl, who used to sit on my lap while I fixed radios in the garage, was now breathless and flushed not with joy but with shame. She told the guard it was okay that I was her father, but she would not look me in the eye. She whispered that I should have parked down the road and walked up. She said the neighbors talk Dad, and this truck is an eyesore. I swallowed the lump in my throat and parked where she pointed, behind a row of hedges where the catering vans were hidden. Walking into that party felt like stepping onto a different planet. The lawn was covered in white tents. There were ice sculptures melting in the summer heat and a tower of champagne glasses that sparkled like diamonds. Everyone was wearing linen and silk. The air smelled of expensive perfume and entitlement. I smoothed down my shirt. It was clean and pressed, but the collar was frayed. I saw heads turn. I saw the whispers behind hands. I saw the way people created a small, empty circle around me as if poverty was a contagious disease. I was looking for a familiar face when I saw them. Richard and Victoria Kensington were holding court near the pool. Victoria was a woman who wore her wealth like armor. She had never worked a day in her life, but she looked at working people as if we were a different species. I approached them holding the gift I had spent 3 weeks working on. It was a vintage clock from the 1920s. I had found it broken in a flea market and spent sleepless nights machining new gears, polishing the brass, and restoring the wood. It was a piece of history. It was something real. I cleared my throat and wished Preston a happy birthday. I held out the clock. The music seemed to stop. The chatter died down. Victoria looked at the gift in my hands. She did not smile. She did not say thank you. She reached out and took it, using a white cocktail napkin as a barrier between her skin and the wood. She held it up for the guests to see, but not with pride. She held it like an exterminator holds a dead rat. "Oh, look, everyone," she announced, her voice carrying over the garden. "Bernie brought us an antique." Or is it just old? She turned the clock over, inspecting the bottom. It smells like oil and old basement. I hope it does not have termites or bacteria. We have to be so careful with these rustic items, don't we? The crowd laughed. It was a polite, cruel ripple of laughter that cut deeper than any insult. I saw Preston, my son-in-law, standing with his golf buddies. He was laughing too. He made a show of wiping his hands on his pants after shaking mine earlier as if my touch had soiled him. I looked at Emily. I waited for her to step in. I waited for her to say that her father was a master mechanic, that this clock was a work of art. But she just stared at her shoes, her face burning red. She was wishing I would disappear. Victoria handed the clock to a passing waiter. "Put this in the garage," she said loud enough for me to hear. "We can sanitize it later or just throw it out." I stood there, my hands empty, my heart pounding a rhythm of pure rage against my ribs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them that I could buy this entire estate and turn it into a parking lot, but I didn't. I clenched my fists inside my pockets and forced a smile. I did it for Emily. I told myself to endure it for one more hour. Dinner was announced and the guests moved toward the long tables set up under the marquee. There were name cards at every seat. I walked up and down the main table looking for my name. I saw Richard and Victoria at the head. I saw Preston and Emily to their right. I saw senators and bankers and socialites. But I did not see Bernard Caldwell. I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was the house manager. He gave me a tight, pitying smile and pointed toward the corner of the tent near the kitchen entrance. There was a small round table there away from the main party. It was set for 4. Sitting there were the 2 nannies who were watching the guests' children and a private security guard who was on his break. That was my place, the children's table, the staff table. I walked over and sat down. The chair was wobbly. From my vantage point, I could see the head table perfectly. I saw the waiters pouring vintage wine for Richard. I saw Victoria laughing, throwing her head back, exposing her long neck. I saw Preston leaning over to whisper something to a friend, pointing discreetly in my direction. I could read his lips. He called me the help. I sat there and I ate the cold chicken they served me. I did not taste a single bite. My mind was racing. I was replaying 40 years of memories. I thought about the day I met Richard's father, Old Man Kensington, 40 years ago. He was a good man, a desperate man who needed a lifeline. I gave him my life savings to save his company. He promised me 51% of the voting shares in a secret trust called Atlas. He kept his word. He respected me. He knew the value of a man who works with his hands. But his son, Richard, knew nothing. Richard only knew the money he inherited. He did not know where it came from. He did not know the silent whale swimming beneath his little boat. As I watched him toast to his own success, to his brilliance, to the Kensington legacy, I felt something inside me shift. It was the click of a lock turning. The patience I had held onto for decades finally ran out. I watched Emily at the main table. She looked miserable. She was pregnant with my grandchild, but she looked thin and anxious. She was trying so hard to please these people, to fit into their mold. And in doing so, she was letting them erase her father. She was letting them treat me like a stray dog they were forced to feed. That hurt more than the insults. That hurt more than the isolation. After the main course was cleared, Richard stood up and tapped his glass. He made a speech about family values and tradition. He spoke about the future of Kensington Dynamics, about the upcoming IPO that would make them billionaires. He looked straight at the investors in the crowd and smiled his shark smile. He did not look at me. To him, I was invisible. I was just a background extra in the movie of his life. But then he did something unexpected. He gestured for the waiter to bring me a drink. Not a glass of the fine wine everyone else was drinking, but a bottle of cheap beer. He had it sent to my table in the corner. It was a deliberate, calculated insult, a reminder of my place, a reminder that no matter how much money they had, they would never have class. I didn't touch the beer. I just stared at Richard across the room. Our eyes met for a second. He winked at me a condescending, arrogant wink. In that moment, I knew. I knew that I could not just go home and tend to my garden. I knew that leaving them alone was no longer an option. They were not just arrogant, they were dangerous. They were destroying my daughter's spirit, and they were planning something with the company, something reckless. I could feel it in my gut. I finished my meal in silence. The nannies at the table were kind. They asked me about my truck, about my life. They treated me with more respect in 5 minutes than the Kensington family had in 5 years. When the dessert was served, I stood up. I had had enough. I was ready to leave. I was ready to call Jerome and unleash the storm. But as I turned to go, the house manager appeared again. He blocked my path. "Mr. Kensington would like a word with you in the library," he said. His tone made it clear this was not a request. It was a summons. I looked at the library windows, glowing with golden light. I thought about just walking away, getting in my truck, and never looking back. But curiosity is a powerful thing. I wanted to hear what Richard had to say. I wanted to see how far he would push. I walked toward the main house, my boots heavy on the stone path. I did not know it then, but I was walking toward the end of my old life. I was walking toward a conversation that would force me to pull the trigger on a weapon I had kept hidden for 40 years. I adjusted my flannel shirt, took a deep breath, and opened the heavy oak doors. The silent wail was about to surface. The library was significantly colder than the rest of the house, as if the temperature had been lowered to preserve the expensive art on the walls, or perhaps just to make guests uncomfortable. The room smelled of old leather and unlit cigars, a masculine scent that Richard clearly bought, rather than earned. He was standing behind a desk that looked big enough to land a plane on. He did not look up when I closed the heavy oak doors behind me. He was busy pouring an amber liquid into a crystal glass from a decanter that likely cost more than my monthly grocery bill. The sound of the ice clinking against the glass was the only noise in the room. I stood there waiting for an invitation to sit that never came. He took a long, slow sip of his scotch and finally deigned to look at me. His eyes were flat, void of any warmth. He gestured vaguely to the empty space in front of his desk, leaving me to stand like a naughty schoolboy called to the principal office. He did not offer me a drink. He did not offer me a chair. He simply leaned back against his desk, crossing his ankles, and staring at me with a look of bored disdain. "You know, Bernie," he started, his voice smooth and practiced like a politician giving a speech to a crowd he despises. "We are moving toward a very sensitive time for Kensington dynamics. We are preparing for an initial public offering in the next quarter. The eyes of Wall Street are upon us. Every detail matters. Every association is scrutinized by bankers and investors who value image above all else." He took another sip of his drink, swirling the liquid around. "To be blunt, your presence is a distraction. You have a certain rustic charm, I suppose, for a mechanic. But on a balance sheet, you are what we call a rustic liability. Investors want sophistication, Bernie. They want pedigree. They do not want a grandfather who looks like he just crawled out from under a pickup truck holding their future heir in photos. It sends the wrong message. It suggests a lack of refinement in the family bloodline." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope. He did not hand it to me. He slid it across the polished wood surface until it stopped at the edge right in front of my belt buckle. It sat there heavy and ominous. I looked at it and then back at him. "What is this?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the anger boiling in my veins. "It is a solution," Richard said. "It is a generous severance package from this family, if you will. Open it." I picked up the envelope. My rough fingers struggled for a moment with the expensive paper before I tore it open. Inside was a cashier check. I pulled it out and looked at the numbers. $10,000. It was a lot of money to a poor man. It was enough to fix my truck and pay rent for a year, but coming from him, it felt like pocket change thrown at a beggar. Behind the check was a legal document stapled and thick. I scanned the first page and my blood ran cold. It was a voluntary termination of visitation rights. It was a contract agreeing that I would never contact my unborn grandchild or attend any public event associated with the Kensington family. It was a gag order disguised as an agreement. It demanded that I remain invisible, that I erase myself from my daughter's life and the life of her child in exchange for cash. Clause 4 stood out to me. The undersigned agrees to maintain a distance of at least 500 yards from any Kensington property or corporate event to preserve the reputation and brand integrity of the family. I looked up at Richard. He was watching me expectantly, waiting for me to take the bait. "You think you can buy my grandchild?" I asked quietly. "It is not buying Bernie," he corrected me with a smirk. "It is compensating you for your absence. We think it is best for the child to be raised in a consistent environment, an environment of success and high standards. We do not want the child confused by the disparity between our lifestyle and yours. Take the money, go on a long vacation, buy a new truck, just go away." I felt a movement in the corner of the room. I had been so focused on Richard and the insulting document that I hadn't noticed her standing in the shadows by the bookshelves. Emily stepped forward, her face pale and stray with dried tears. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Her shoulders were slumped, and she was wringing her hands nervously. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She looked at the floor, at the rug, at Richard, anywhere but at me. I held up the check, my hand trembling not from fear, but from a rage so cold it burned. I looked at my daughter, the girl I had raised on my own after her mother died, the girl I had taught to ride a bike and balance a checkbook. "Emily?" I said, my voice low and pleading. "Is this what you want? Do you want to sell your father for $10,000? Do you want your child to never know who I am?" She flinched as if I had slapped her. She took a shuddering breath and finally looked at me, but her eyes were empty of the fire she used to have. "Take it, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please just take it. It is for the best. It is good for the baby. Preston and his parents think it will be less stressful this way. You know how you are. You do not fit in here. It is just too hard on everyone when you come around. Good for the baby to not know its grandfather. To be raised by people who think love is a transaction." I looked at Richard, who was checking his watch, as if this transaction was taking too long. He looked bored. He thought he had won. He thought he had crushed the little man with his wallet. I looked down at the check in my hand. $10,000. The price of my dignity. The price of my family. I slowly took the check in both hands. The sound of the paper tearing was sharp and loud in the quiet room. I ripped it down the middle. Then I ripped it again and again until it was nothing but confetti. I let the pieces flutter down onto his expensive Persian rug. Richard's eyes widened slightly, his composure cracking for just a second. He had not expected that. He had expected me to be grateful. But I did not tear the contract. I folded the legal document carefully and placed it into my shirt pocket next to my heart. I needed it. I needed the proof of their cruelty. I needed the evidence of exactly who they were. I looked Richard dead in the eye. "You worry about your stock price, Richard. You worry about the value of your company. You should, because I am going to be watching it very closely. You think I am a rustic liability? You have no idea what a liability looks like yet, but you will." I turned to Emily. She was crying openly now, but she did not move toward me. She stayed on their side of the room. "Goodbye, Emily," I said. "I hope the money is warm enough to hold you at night, because that is all you have left. I turned my back on them, on the luxury, on the betrayal, and walked out of the library. I marched past the stunned guests in the garden, past the security guard who smirked at me, and got into my old truck. As I drove away, the engine rattled and coughed, but I did not hear it. All I could hear was the sound of war drums beating in my heart. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had not called in years. "Jerome," I said, when he answered, "Clear your schedule. We are going to audit Kensington Dynamics. I want to know exactly why Richard is so afraid of a poor old man." The drive back to my cabin was a blur of asphalt and heartache. My old truck rattled down the highway, but the noise couldn't drown out the sound of my daughter's voice pleading with me to take the money. That $10,000 check. It wasn't the insult of the amount that burned in my chest. It was the fact that Emily, the little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the teenager I had taught to drive in this very truck, had looked at me with pity and shame. She had chosen them. She had chosen the marble floors and the cold stares over the man who had dried her tears when her mother died. I pulled into the gravel driveway of my small wooden cabin. It sits on 4 acres of land surrounded by pine trees. To anyone driving by, it looks like the home of a man who is scraped by his entire life. The paint is peeling slightly on the porch railing. There is a stack of firewood by the door that I chopped myself. It is simple. It is quiet. It is the only place where I have ever felt like myself. But tonight, walking up those steps, I felt a strange heaviness. For 40 years, I had worn this simplicity like a comfortable coat. I had hidden my true nature to protect myself, to keep life genuine. But seeing how easily my own flesh and blood could discard me, because of that simplicity, made me question everything. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the darkness. The air smelled of cedar and old coffee. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked straight to the small bedroom at the back of the house. I pushed aside the heavy oak dresser that had belonged to my grandfather. It scraped loudly against the floorboards, a harsh sound in the quiet night. Beneath it lay a rug that hadn't been moved in years. I rolled it back, revealing the rough pine planks of the floor. There was one loose board, indistinguishable from the rest unless you knew exactly where to press. I pried it up. Underneath, embedded in the foundation of the house, was a steel safe. It wasn't a modern digital box. It was a heavy fireproof behemoth from the 70s, covered in a layer of gray dust. My hands were steady now. The trembling rage from the party had settled into a cold, hard resolve. I spun the dial. Right to 22, left to 48, right to 10. The tumblers clicked into place with a satisfying thud that echoed in the silence. I pulled the heavy handle and the door swung open. Inside, there were no stacks of cash. There were no gold bars or diamonds. There was just a thick, leather-bound portfolio and a few yellowing envelopes. I pulled the portfolio out and carried it to the kitchen table. I turned on the single overhead lamp. The light was dim, casting long shadows across the room. I opened the leather cover. The first document on top was the original incorporation paper of the Atlas Trust dated September the 19th, 1980. I ran my finger over the signatures. There was mine firm and clear, and there was Arthur Kensington's, Richard's father. I closed my eyes and let the memory wash over me. It was 44 years ago. Arthur wasn't a titan of industry then. He was a frantic young inventor working out of a rented garage in Queens, trying to build a new type of hydraulic system for industrial machinery. I was a mechanic back then, working double shifts, saving every penny, investing in patents that nobody else saw value in. I had met Arthur when his prototype failed, and he couldn't afford to fix it. I fixed it for free because I liked the way his mind worked. We had sat on crates in that greasy garage drinking cheap beer. Arthur was crying. He told me the bank was pulling his loan. He told me Kensington Dynamics was dead before it even started. He needed $200,000 to secure the manufacturing contract that would launch the company. To him, it was an impossible sum. To me, it was a risk, but a calculated one. I had the money. I had made a fortune in the late 70s on a lucky land deal that nobody knew about. I wrote him a check that night. I told him I didn't want a seat on the board. I didn't want my name on the building. I wanted 51% of the voting stock held in a blind trust, and I wanted him to run the company as if it were his own. I wanted to be the silent partner, the safety net. Arthur had looked at me like I was an angel. He swore he would never forget, and he didn't. Until the day he died, Arthur treated me like a king. But he respected my wish for anonymity. He never told Richard the truth. He only told him that the Atlas Trust was a silent investor group that had to be consulted on major decisions. Richard grew up thinking Atlas was some faceless conglomerate in Switzerland. He never guessed that Atlas was the man fixing his bicycle in the driveway. I turned the page of the portfolio. There it was the most recent valuation report from the last fiscal quarter. I looked at the number at the bottom of the page. It was a number that would make Richard Kensington vomit the expensive scotch he had been drinking. 10,400 million. That was the current value of the assets held by the Atlas Trust. My assets, my money. The rustic liability that Richard wanted to erase from his family photo album held the power to buy and sell his entire existence 10 times over. I stared at the document for a long time. For years, I had let the dividends reinvest. I had lived off my pension and my small savings because I liked the quiet life. I didn't want the complications of wealth. I didn't want people to love me for my checkbook. But look where that had gotten me. My daughter loved the illusion of wealth more than the reality of her father. My son-in-law sneered at the hands that actually built the foundation of his luxury. I closed the portfolio. The snap of the leather sounded like a gunshot. I reached for the old rotary phone on the wall. I still kept a landline because cell service out here was spotty, but mostly because I liked the weight of the receiver. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang once, twice. Jerome Blackwood answered on the third ring. His voice was crisp alert despite the late hour. Jerome was the only person on earth who knew the whole truth. He was my lawyer, my confidant, and the shark I kept in a very expensive tank in Manhattan. Bernie, he said I wasn't expecting a call tonight. Is everything all right? No, Jerome. I said, my voice grating like gravel. Everything is far from all right. There was a pause on the line. I could hear the rustle of papers, the shift in his tone from friend to attorney. What happened? I went to the party, I told him. I told him about the security guard, the clock, the table in the corner, the envelope. I told him about Richard calling me a liability. I told him about Emily's silence. Jerome let out a low whistle. They gave you a check for $10,000. That is rich, even for Richard. So what are we doing, Bernie? You finally ready to cash out? Do you want me to liquidate the trust? We can have the shares on the market by Monday morning. We can crash the stock price before their IPO even hits the roadshow. You walk away with $10 billion, and they walk away with a smoking crater. I looked at the documents on the table. Destroying them would be easy. It would be satisfying, but it wouldn't be enough. If I just sold everything, Richard would spin it. He would find a way to blame market forces. He would play the victim. And Emily, she would just see it as her father ruining her husband's future out of spite. She wouldn't understand the lesson. No, I said, that is too quick. That is too messy. Then what? Jerome asked. You want to buy them out? Force a hostile takeover. Kick Richard out of the CEO chair and put someone else in. I leaned back in my wooden chair, the wood creaking under my weight. I want you to trigger the audit clause, I said. The line went silent for a second. The Section 8 clause. Bernie, we haven't used that in 30 years. That gives the trust full access to every email, every receipt, every shadow account in the company. That is a declaration of war. Exactly. I said Richard is desperate for this IPO. He is pushing too hard. He tried to buy me off with a contract to keep me away from the company. A man doesn't do that because he is embarrassed by his in-laws. A man does that because he is hiding something. He is afraid I'll see something. I shouldn't. You think he is cooking the books? Jerome asked, his voice sharpening. I think a man who treats family like a transaction probably treats business the same way, I replied. I want to know why they are bleeding cash. I want to know why Preston is gambling at high-stakes tables when he supposedly works in acquisitions. I want to know everything, Jerome. I want you to dig until your shovel hits bedrock. Consider it done. Jerome said, I'll have the forensic accountants there by Tuesday morning. But Bernie, once we start this, the Kensingtons are going to panic. The IPO will be frozen, the stock will wobble. Richard is going to come for you. He thinks you are just a nuisance now. When the auditors show up representing the majority shareholder, he is going to think you are somehow involved, or he is going to try to crush whoever he thinks is behind it. Let him try, I said. He thinks he is fighting a ghost. He thinks the Atlas Trust is some board of directors in Geneva. Let him keep thinking that. I want to watch him sweat. I want to see what falls out of his pockets when we shake him upside down. I will draft the papers tonight. Jerome said, Get some sleep, Bernie. You sound tired. I am not tired, Jerome. I said, looking at the stock certificate one last time before closing the safe. I am just getting started. I hung up the phone and sat in the dim light of the kitchen. The silence of the cabin didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like the calm before a storm. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. I didn't see the old mechanic in the flannel shirt. I saw the man who had bet on Arthur Kensington 40 years ago. I saw the silent whale rising from the deep. And for the first time all day, I smiled. Tuesday morning arrived with a heavy gray mist that clung to the pine trees outside my cabin. I was pouring my second cup of black coffee when I saw headlights cut through the fog. It wasn't a limousine or a flashy sports car. It was a nondescript dark sedan, the kind of car that blends into traffic and disappears. Jerome Blackwood knew how to move in the shadows. He stepped out of the car wearing a wool coat over his suit, carrying a titanium briefcase that looked like it could survive a nuclear blast. He didn't look like a man who controlled billions of dollars. He looked like a tired accountant, which was exactly why he was the most dangerous shark in New York. He walked up the porch steps and I opened the door before he could knock. We didn't exchange pleasantries. He just nodded and walked straight to my kitchen table, the same table where I ate my canned beans and read my newspapers. He set the briefcase down and opened it. Inside was a laptop that hummed to life instantly, and a stack of printed documents that were still warm. Jerome took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and transformed from my old friend into the forensic auditor who had taken down hedge funds and corrupt senators. He turned the laptop screen toward me. The glow illuminated his silver hair, and the deep lines etched around his eyes. Bernie, look at this, he said, his voice low and tight. We triggered the Section 8 clause at midnight. The system let us in. It took my team 6 hours to bypass their firewalls and access the raw ledger. What we found isn't just bad management. It is criminal. I pulled my chair closer, squinting at the columns of numbers that danced across the screen. I know engines. I know how to listen to a piston and tell you if a valve is stuck. But looking at these spreadsheets felt like looking at an engine that was running on oil and prayer. There were red lines everywhere. Jerome pointed a manicured finger at a column labeled Q3 revenue. See this number here? Jerome asked. Richard reported $150 million in sales last quarter. He told the board and the potential IPO underwriters that demand is up 40%. But look at the shipping logs, Bernie. Look at the inventory. They didn't ship $150 million worth of product. They shipped maybe 30 million. I frowned, trying to understand the mechanics of the lie. How can they report sales if they didn't ship anything I asked? Booking fake revenue, Jerome explained with a grim smile. They are creating invoices for shell companies that don't exist. They record the sale to boost the numbers on paper, so the stock valuation goes up, but no money is actually coming in. It is a ghost ship. Bernie. The company looks massive from the outside, but inside it is completely hollow. He typed a few keys and a new window popped up. It showed a complex web of wire transfers. This is where the money is supposed to be, he said, pointing to a series of accounts. But look where it actually goes. Cayman Islands, Panama, Luxembourg. They are moving what little cash they have into offshore accounts to hide the debt. They are borrowing money from one bank to pay the interest on a loan from another bank. It is a Ponzi scheme built on the Kensington name. But why, I asked? The company was profitable for 30 years. Arthur built a machine that printed money. How did Richard break it? Richard didn't break it alone. Jerome said he clicked on a folder named Expenses. Miscellaneous. He scrolled down, and the name Preston Kensington appeared over and over again. My son-in-law, the man who wiped his hands after touching mine, the man who bought my daughter diamond earrings while I was driving strangers to the airport. Preston has been busy, Jerome said, his voice dripping with disdain. He is listed as a consultant for acquisitions, but look at these withdrawals. These 50,000 here, 200,000 there, all transferred to casinos in Las Vegas, Atlantic City, and Macau. And here, look at these credit card statements paid by the company. Private jets, suites at the Wynn, watches, cars. I felt sick. My stomach churned as I looked at the total at the bottom of the spreadsheet. 50 million. Preston had drained 50 million from the company in 4 years. He wasn't a businessman. He was a parasite. He was gambling away the legacy my father saved and Arthur built. He was betting with my money. So they are broke. I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. They are worse than broke, Jerome said, closing the laptop with a snap. They are insolvent. If the SEC looks at these books for 5 minutes, Richard and Preston go to federal prison for 20 years. That is why they are pushing for the IPO so hard, Bernie. That is why they need to go public. They need the influx of cash from new investors to fill the $50 million hole before anyone notices. They are trying to sell a burning house to the public and hoping the fire department doesn't show up until they have cashed out. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the pines. This explains everything, Bernie. It explains the contract. It explains the check. It explains why Richard was sweating in that library. I stood up too, my legs feeling heavy. Explain it to me, Jerome, I said. Think about it. He turned to face me. You are the Atlas Trust. You own 51% of the voting stock. They cannot sell the company without your signature. They cannot launch an IPO without the majority shareholder signing off on the prospectus. But Richard thinks Atlas is some faceless entity he can manipulate. What he is terrified of is scrutiny. If you show up at a shareholder meeting looking like a mechanic and asking questions, the press will dig. The underwriters will get nervous. They will look closer. Richard needs total control. He needs to present a perfect unified front. He wanted you gone not because you are embarrassing, but because you are a loose end. He needed you to sign that document waiving your rights to interfere so that when the auditors come, he can show them that the family is silent and compliant. He wanted to neutralize me. I said, the anger rising again, cold and sharp. He wanted to make sure I stayed in my lane so he could finish robbing the company. Exactly, Jerome said. and he needed the cash from the sale to pay off Preston's gambling debts before the loan sharks start breaking legs. They are desperate, Bernie. They are standing on a trapdoor and the rope is fraying. They are terrified that if the IPO fails, they lose everything, the mansions, the cars, the status. They will be destitute. I looked down at my rough hands. I thought about the $10,000 Richard had thrown at me. He had offered me pennies to save his own skin. He had treated me like dirt while standing on a mountain of debt that I effectively owned. So what do we do? Jerome asked, breaking my trance. We have enough here to bury them. I can send this to the district attorney this afternoon. We can have them arrested by dinner time. We can freeze their assets. We can liquidate the company and salvage what is left. You walk away with billions, and they walk away in handcuffs. I shook my head slowly. No, I said, that is too easy. If they go to jail now, they become victims in their own minds. They will say they were persecuted. They will blame the market. And Emily will hate me. She will see me as the monster who sent her husband to prison. Clears throat. She doesn't know the truth. She thinks they are gods. I walked over to the safe and looked down at the floorboards I had pried up the night before. I need them to reveal themselves, I said. I need Emily to see them for what they really are. I need Richard to stand up in front of the world and lie one more time so I can pull the rug out from under him when he feels safest. Jerome watched me carefully. You want to play with them? He asked. I want to break them, I replied. But I want to do it on my terms. I want to look Richard in the eye when he realizes that the rustic liability just foreclosed on his life. Jerome smiled a shark smile that matched my own. Very well, Bernie. If we are going to do this, we need to be smart. We need to let them think they are winning. We need to let them think the Atlas Trust is asleep at the wheel. What is the next step? I asked. Jerome reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. We leak a rumor, he said. We tell a few key people on Wall Street that the Atlas Trust is considering selling its position, that we are looking for a buyer. I nodded, understanding immediately. That will panic Richard. He will think he is about to lose control before the IPO, exactly. Jerome said he will try to rush the sale. He will try to bypass the regulations. He will make mistakes, and when he does, we will be there to catch him. But I need to get closer. I said, reading reports isn't enough. I need to hear what they are saying when they think no one is listening. I need to know what they are planning for my daughter. Jerome raised an eyebrow. You want to bug his office? I want to do more than that, I said. I used to fix the HVAC systems in that building 40 years ago. I know every vent. I know every service corridor. I still have the master key set Arthur gave me in 1985. You are going inside. Jerome asked, his voice showing a hint of concern. I am going inside, I confirmed. I am going to be the fly on the wall. I am going to be the ghost in the machine. Jerome sighed, but he didn't argue. He knew that look in my eye. It was the same look my father had when he bet everything on a stranger. Just be careful, Bernie, he said. Richard is cornered and cornered animals bite. I picked up the black coffee from the table. It was cold now, but I drank it anyway. Let him bite, I said. I have thick skin. Jerome packed up the laptop, leaving me with copies of the incriminating files. He walked to the door and turned back. One more thing, Bernie. That check you tore up. The $10,000. Yeah, I said. Technically, that was company money. Embezzled company money. Richard tried to pay you off with your own cash. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Of course he did. Or is he added to the list, Jerome? Added to the bill. When Jerome left, I stood in the doorway watching his car disappear into the mist. The fog was lifting, revealing the sharp edges of the world. I knew what I had to do. I had to become someone else. I had to put away the grieving widower hour and the tired driver. I had to become the silent whale. And the first thing the whale was going to do was swim right into the heart of the storm. I turned back into the cabin and started looking for my old toolbox. It was time to go to work. The dust from Jerome's departure had barely settled when I heard the crunch of gravel again. This time it was not a sedan, but a sleek white Range Rover that looked ridiculous parked next to my woodpile. I watched from the window as my daughter Emily stepped out. She was not wearing the designer silk she had worn at the party. She was wearing a simple cotton dress and a cardigan that looked a little too big for her. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she carried a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. It was a scene straight out of my memories. It was exactly how she used to look when she came home from college on weekends before the Kensingtons got their claws into her. I opened the door and she stood there on the porch, looking up at me with big, watery eyes. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice trembling, just enough to tug at my heartstrings. "I brought you something." She lifted the cloth to reveal a deep dish apple pie. It was still warm. The smell hit me instantly. Cinnamon nutmeg and tart apples. It was her mother's recipe. It was the smell of every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every apology in this house for 30 years. I let her in. I couldn't help it. She was my little girl, and she looked so tired. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had plotted the destruction of her husband's family just hours before. She cut a slice for me and one for herself, but she didn't eat. She just pushed the crumbs around with her fork. "I am sorry about the party, Dad." She whispered, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "It was awful. Victoria can be so difficult. And Preston is just under so much pressure. You have no idea." I watched her carefully. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the girl who used to help me change the oil in the truck was still in there somewhere. "What kind of pressure, Emily?" I asked softly. She looked up, her eyes wide and pleading. "The IPO, Dad, it is everything to them. If it doesn't go well, they could lose the estate. Preston hasn't slept in weeks. He is snapping at everyone. He loves you. Really, he does. But he is just terrified that something will go wrong. That is why Richard was so harsh. They are just scared." She reached across the table and took my hand. Her hand was cold. "Dad, please. Just sign the paper, not for them. For me. For your grandson. If you sign it, the stress goes away. We can be a family again. Quietly. We can come visit you here. We just need to get through this launch. Please, Dad. I can't take the fighting anymore." My heart cracked. I looked at her tired face, the dark circles under her eyes. Maybe I was being too hard. Maybe Richard really was just a desperate man trying to save his legacy. Maybe Preston was just a scared kid. And Emily, she was caught in the middle, pregnant and alone in that big house. All she wanted was peace. I looked at the pie. I looked at my daughter. I felt the anger draining out of me, replaced by a father's instinct to fix things, to make the pain stop. "I will get the paper," I said, standing up. "It is in my bedroom." "Oh, thank you, Dad. Thank you," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "You are saving my life." I walked toward the bedroom, feeling a heavy resignation. I would sign their contract. I would take their money. I would disappear if it meant Emily could be happy. I would be the rustic liability one last time. As I reached the door, Emily stood up abruptly. "I need to use the restroom," she said, rushing past me toward the bathroom down the hall. She left her purse and her phone sitting on the kitchen table right next to the Halliton pie. I went into my room and retrieved the crumpled contract from my jacket pocket. I smoothed it out on the dresser. I uncapped my pen. I stared at the signature line. Bernard Caldwell. I was about to sign away my rights to my own blood. I took a deep breath, ready to surrender. Then I heard a sharp ping from the kitchen, then another and another. A rapid-fire series of notifications. I walked back into the kitchen. The phone screen was lit up facing the ceiling. The messages were popping up one after another in green bubbles. I didn't mean to look, but the name at the top of the screen stopped me dead in my tracks. The contact was saved as Queen Victoria. I stepped closer. The messages were visible on the lock screen. Did you get the signature yet? The first one read, "Don't forget to cry. The old fool is a sucker for tears." That was the second. "Remember the deal, Emily. You get him to sign and the Paris trip is yours. Use the baby if you have to. Just get it done so we can evict him from our lives for good." I felt the blood drained from my face. My hands went numb. The pen fell from my fingers and clattered onto the floor. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't stress. It was a script. It was a performance. My daughter wasn't crying because she was hurting. She was crying for a shopping spree in Paris. I reached out and touched the screen. I shouldn't have done it, but I had to know. I swiped down to see the earlier conversation. My thumb hovered over a message Emily had sent to Preston 2 days ago, right after the party. I read the words and felt something inside me die. God, Preston. I know he is embarrassing, Emily had written. Clears throat. He smelled like old engine oil and cheap soap. I nearly gagged when he hugged me. I promise once we get the money, we never have to see him again. He is just a means to an end, babe. I stared at the words until they blurred. Smelled like engine oil. The oil that paid for her braces. The oil that paid for her college tuition. The oil that kept the heat on when winter hit. She didn't just hate my poverty, she hated me. She hated the very essence of who I was. I heard the toilet flush. I heard the tap running. I quickly put the phone back exactly where it was. I picked up the pen from the floor and put it in my pocket. I stood by the window, my back to the room, staring out at the gray sky. My heart was no longer beating. It was just a cold stone in my chest. The father who wanted to save his little girl was gone. In his place was the chairman of the Atlas Trust. Emily came back into the kitchen. She looked refreshed. She had reapplied her lipstick. She smiled at me, a bright, hopeful smile that I now recognized as a shark's grin. "Did you find it, Dad?" she asked sweetly. I turned slowly. I looked at her. Really looked at her. I saw the greed behind the eyes. I saw the calculation in the tilt of her head. "I found it," I said, my voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Great," she said, reaching out her hand. "Do you have a pen? Let's get this over with so we can relax." I didn't move. I didn't reach for the paper. I just looked at her. "I need to think about it, Emily," I said. Her smile faltered. "What do you mean, think about it?" "We talked." "You said I need to think." I repeated, cutting her off. "This is a big decision. Giving up my grandchild. I need to read the fine print. I need to pray on it." "But Dad?" She stepped closer, her voice rising in panic. "We don't have time. Richard needs this by tomorrow morning." "Then Richard can wait," I said. Emily's face twisted. It wasn't the face of a loving daughter anymore. It was the face of a spoiled child who had been denied a toy. "You are being selfish," she snapped. "You are always so stubborn. Why do you have to make everything so hard? Just sign the damn paper, Dad." "Get out," I said. She froze. "What?" "Get out of my house, Emily," I said quietly. "Take your pie, take your lies, and get out." She stared at me, shocked by the coldness in my tone. She opened her mouth to argue, to scream, to manipulate, but something in my eyes stopped her. She saw something there she had never seen before. She saw a wall. "Fine," she spat, grabbing her purse. "Fine. Be a bitter old man. Die alone in this shack. See if I care, but don't expect to see the baby ever." She stormed out, slamming the screen door so hard it rattled the hinges. I watched her get into the Range Rover. I watched her furiously, typing on her phone, probably updating Queen Victoria that the mission had failed. She peeled out of the driveway, throwing gravel everywhere, leaving a cloud of dust in the air. I stood there in the silence of the kitchen. The smell of the apple pie was now nauseating. It smelled like betrayal. I picked up the pie and walked to the trash can. I threw it in pan and all. The crash was the only sound in the house. I walked to the sink and washed my hands, scrubbing them hard, as if I could wash away the touch of her false affection. I looked at my reflection in the window. My eyes were dry. I had no tears left for Emily Kensington. She had made her choice. She wanted the money. She wanted the lifestyle. Well, I thought drying my hands on a rag. She was going to get exactly what she wanted. She wanted a business transaction. I would give her the biggest business transaction of her life. I walked back to the bedroom and pulled my old toolbox from under the bed. It was heavy battered and smelled of oil. The smell she hated. I opened it and took out a set of precision screwdrivers, a soldering iron, and a small black box I had built years ago for testing circuits. It was time to modify it. I wasn't just a mechanic. I was an engineer who had never gotten the degree. I knew how machines worked and I knew how to break them. But this time I wasn't fixing an engine. I was building a Trojan horse. I picked up the toy airplane I had bought for my unborn grandson, a vintage model P-51 Mustang. I looked at it for a moment, then picked up a screwdriver. I was going into the lion's den and I was going to bring back the only thing that mattered now. The truth recorded in high definition. I sat at my workbench under the harsh light of a swinging bulb and let the world narrow down to the tip of a soldering iron. For the first time in months, my hands were steady. I was not trembling with rage or hunger anymore. I was operating with the cold precision of a surgeon. The P-51 Mustang model sat disassembled before me. It was a beautiful thing made of die-cast metal and high-impact plastic. But I was about to give it a heart. I carefully removed the cockpit assembly and drilled a microscopic hole behind the pilot seat. Into this void, I inserted a high-fidelity microphone no larger than a grain of rice. It was technology I had acquired through Jerome's Connections military race stuff that could pick up a whisper from across a room. I wired the microphone to a battery pack I had salvaged from a high-end hearing aid and a transmitter I stripped from a long-range tracking device. I had to shave down the interior plastic of the fuselage to make it all fit. It took me 3 hours of painstaking work. My eyes strained and my back ached, but I did not stop until I snapped the two halves of the plane back together. I ran my thumb over the seam. It was invisible. To the naked eye, it was just a toy, a nostalgic piece of decor, but to me, it was a loaded weapon. I tested the frequency on my old radio. The feedback squeal was sharp and clear. It was ready. The next morning, I shaved my beard down to a stubble and put on a pair of navy blue coveralls I had bought at a thrift store. I stitched a generic patch onto the chest that read City Courier Services. I pulled a baseball cap low over my eyes and looked in the mirror. Bernard Caldwell, the millionaire investor, was gone. In his place was just another invisible service worker, the kind of man people look through without ever seeing. I picked up the clipboard I had prepared and the cardboard box containing the modified airplane. I was not going to the front door this time. I was going to the belly of the beast. I parked my truck 3 blocks away from the Kensington Dynamics headquarters. It was a glass tower that jutted out of the city skyline like a jagged tooth. I walked to the loading dock around the back. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to slow. I knew this building better than the architect who designed it. Back in '85, when Arthur was expanding, I had personally designed the redundant HVAC systems for the server rooms. I knew that the service elevator in Bay 4 had a bypass key switch that never got changed because the maintenance crew was too lazy to update the protocols. I knew that the freight corridor on the 30th floor ran directly behind the executive suites to allow for discrete equipment upgrades. I walked up to the loading dock security checkpoint. The guard was a young kid glued to his phone. I held up my clipboard and muttered something about a priority package for facilities management. He didn't even look up, he just waved me through. I walked past him, my boots echoing on the concrete. Step 1 was complete. I made my way to the service elevator. I pulled out a master keyring I had kept in my safe for decades. It was a heavy brass key, worn smooth by time. I slid it into the maintenance override slot. The door slid open instantly. The ride up to the 30th floor felt like an eternity. I watched the floor numbers tick upward. 18, 19, 20, my palms were sweating inside my work gloves. If Richard was in his office, this would all be for nothing. If I was caught, I would be arrested for trespassing and corporate espionage. The IPO would go through, and my daughter would be lost forever. The elevator dinged and the doors opened. I stepped out into the plush, carpeted hallway of the executive wing. It was quiet. It was lunch hour. I had timed this perfectly. I kept my head down, walking with purpose. If you look like you know where you are going, nobody questions you. I turned the corner toward the CEO's office. That was when I saw him. The head of security, a man named Miller, who had been with the company since Arthur's days. He was walking toward me, talking into a radio. He wasn't a kid on a phone. He was a professional. He stopped 10 FT away from me, his eyes narrowing. "Hey you," he barked. "Hold up. Where's your badge?" I froze. I tightened my grip on the box. I forced myself to look confused, not scared. Facilities. I grunted, pitching my voice lower, just dropping off a filter replacement for the AC unit in Suite 304. Miller stepped closer. He looked at my face. For a second, I thought he recognized me. I thought he saw the eyes of the man he had thrown out of the party. But then he looked at my coveralls. He looked at the grease under my fingernails. He sniffed the air and smelled the old engine oil I had dabbed on my neck. He wrinkled his nose. "Service elevator is back that way," he said, pointing a thumb over his shoulder. "Do not use the main hall." "You are tracking dirt on the carpet." "Yes, sir," I said, bobbing my head. "Sorry, sir." He watched me turn around. I walked away, waiting for a hand on my shoulder, waiting for him to realize who I was. But he just turned back to his radio and kept walking. I ducked into the alcove of the executive restroom, waited for him to round the corner, and then doubled back. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would crack a rib. I reached Richard's office. The door was heavy frosted glass. I didn't knock. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. Arrogance. He thought he was untouchable. I slipped inside and closed the door softly behind me. The office was a shrine to his ego awards on the walls, pictures of him shaking hands with politicians. And there on the bookshelf behind his massive desk was his collection of vintage model aircraft. Right in the center sat a P-51 Mustang identical to the one in my box. I'd given it to him 10 years ago when he married Emily. He had kept it not out of sentiment, but because it fit the aesthetic of the room. I moved fast. I opened my box and took out the bugged plane. I grabbed the original from the shelf and dropped it into my box. I placed the new one in the exact same spot, adjusting the angle so it matched the dust outline on the shelf. It took 10 seconds. 10 seconds to plant a bomb in the middle of his life. I checked the room one last time. Nothing out of place. I grabbed my box and walked out. The walk back to the elevator was a blur. I didn't breathe until the doors closed, and I was descending back to the loading dock. I walked out into the sunshine past the guard who was still on his phone and didn't stop until I was back in the cab of my truck. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't put the key in the ignition. I sat there for a moment laughing, a breathless, jagged sound. I had done it. The rustic liability had just compromised the most secure office in the city. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message to Jerome. The bird has landed. A minute later, my phone buzzed. It was a link to a secure audio stream. I put in my earbuds and tapped the screen. At first, there was just the hiss of static. Then I heard the sound of a heavy door opening and footsteps on carpet. I heard Richard's voice clear as a bell. "Get me legal on the phone and pour me a drink." I started the truck and pulled into traffic. The audio feed played in my ears, the voice of my enemy, broadcasting his secrets directly to me. I wasn't just listening anymore, I was hunting. And the silent wail was closing in for the kill. The static in my earpiece cleared, and suddenly I was in the room with them. I was sitting in the back of Jerome's mobile surveillance van, parked 3 blocks away from the Kensington Tower, but in my mind I was perched on that bookshelf right inside the cockpit of the P-51 Mustang. Jerome sat next to me, adjusting the levels on a digital soundboard, his face illuminated by the green glow of the monitors. We didn't speak, we just listened. The sound of a heavy crystal decanter hitting a glass rang out like a bell. It was followed by the rustle of silk and the distinctive click of high heels on a hardwood floor. Victoria had entered the room. I heard Richard sigh a long exhale of frustration. He asked her if she had spoken to Emily. Victoria's voice was sharp and dismissive. She said that the girl was useless. She said Emily had called her crying, claiming that I had kicked her out of the cabin. Victoria laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a cold, dry sound. She called Emily weak. She said my daughter lacked the killer instinct necessary to be a Kensington. She mocked the way Emily had tried to use the apple pie as a bargaining chip, calling it a pathetic peasant gesture. I sat there in the dark van, gripping the armrests of my chair until my knuckles turned white. Hearing them insult me was one thing. I was used to that. But hearing them tear apart my daughter, the woman who had sacrificed her relationship with me to please them, was agonizing. Richard chimed in. He said he wasn't surprised. He called Emily a bad investment. He said he had only allowed Preston to marry her because she was pliable and because they thought my land might be worth something one day. But now that they knew I was destitute, Emily was just another mouth to feed another expense on the balance sheet. Jerome looked at me, his eyes wide with shock. He reached out to pause the recording, but I shook my head. I needed to hear it all. I needed to drink every drop of this poison so I would never forget why I had to destroy them. They poured another drink. I could hear the ice clinking. Victoria asked about the IPO. Richard sounded confident but tense. He said the numbers were cooked enough to pass a preliminary review, but they needed to sign the underwriters by Friday. He said the only loose end was me. He said he might have to hire someone to scare me off if the contract didn't work. He talked about burning down my cabin as casually as he talked about ordering lunch. He said a little electrical fire would solve the problem of the rustic liability permanently. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. They were not just thieves. They were monsters. They were willing to kill to protect their lifestyle. Jerome was typing furiously on his laptop, documenting every threat, every admission of fraud. But the conversation shifted then, and what came next made the threats of arson seem like mercy. Victoria brought up the baby. She asked Richard if he had heard from Dr. Evans, yet regarding the gender reveal. Richard grunted. He said the results were due this afternoon. Victoria lowered her voice, but the military-grade microphone picked up every syllable. She said they needed to be prepared. She said the Kensington family trusts the small legacy fund left by Richard's grandfather that they actually controlled had a strict clause. The principal could only be accessed by a direct male heir upon birth. If it is a girl, Victoria said, her voice completely devoid of emotion, we cannot afford it, Richard. We need that trust fund money to pay the bridge loan for the IPO. If Emily gives birth to a girl, we are locked out of the cash for another generation. We will be bankrupt before the fiscal year ends. Richard asked what she proposed. He sounded tired, not horrified. Victoria didn't hesitate. She said Dr. Evans was on the payroll. She said if the test came back female, they would tell Emily there were complications, genetic markers, severe deformities, things that would make the child's life miserable. She said they would convince her that a therapeutic termination was the only humane option. They would pressure her. They would tell her she could try again later for a healthy boy. I stopped breathing. The air in the van felt suddenly thin. They were planning to kill my grandchild. They were planning to manipulate my daughter into an abortion she didn't want simply because the baby might be the wrong gender to unlock a bank account. They were going to murder an innocent life for cash flow. I looked at the monitor where the audio waveform was spiking with their voices. I visualized them in that plush office surrounded by awards and luxury plotting this atrocity. I thought about Emily alone and scared, trusting these people with her life and the life of her child. I thought about the little toy plane sitting on the shelf watching them with its painted eyes. A sound ripped out of my throat. It wasn't a scream. It was a growl, a primal noise of pure fury. I slammed my fist onto the metal table of the van so hard that the equipment jumped. The pain in my hand was grounding. It was real. Jerome grabbed my shoulder. "Bernie," he said, his voice urgent. "Bernie, look at me. We have them. This is conspiracy. This is intent to cause bodily harm. We can go to the police right now." "No." I hissed, my eyes burning. My vision was tinged with red. "The police will take too long. They will get lawyers. They will spin it. They will say it was hypothetical. They will intimidate Emily. She is in that house with them right now, Jerome. She is sleeping under the same roof as these butchers." I stood up in the cramped space of the van. I felt like I was expanding, like the sheer force of my rage was making me 10 ft tall. "I am not going to call the police," I said. "I am going to end them. I am going to strip the flesh from their bones. I am going to leave them with nothing. No money, no reputation, no freedom." I looked at the screen again. Richard was laughing now, making a joke about how gullible Emily was, about how she would believe anything Preston told her. "You laugh, Richard," I whispered to the screen. "You laugh while you can, because the silent whale is surfacing, and I am Sam going to swallow you whole." I turned to Jerome. "Get the car ready," I said. "We aren't waiting for the IPO. We aren't waiting for the rumors to take effect." We are moving up the timeline to when Jerome asked. Tonight, I said, "They are having a gala tonight to calm the investors, right? A black-tie dinner at the plaza to show off their stability." "Yes," Jerome said. "It starts at 8. Then we are going to a party," I said. I grabbed my coat. "And Jerome, I want you to prepare the speakers. I want this recording, this exact conversation, to be the soundtrack of their destruction." I stepped out of the van into the cool city air. The noise of the traffic sounded distant. All I could hear was the beating of my own heart and the voice of Victoria Kensington, planning to kill my blood. I looked up at the glass tower reflecting the sunset. It looked like a tombstone. I adjusted my collar. The mechanic was dead. The ride-share driver was dead. The only man left was Bernard Caldwell, and he was coming for blood. Jerome sat in the dim light of the surveillance van with the glow of the laptop screen reflecting in his glasses. He was not typing furiously or sweating. He was calm like an executioner who knows the knot is tied correctly. He opened the secure server for the Atlas Trust, a digital fortress that Richard Kensington believed was run by a cabal of faceless Swiss bankers in Geneva. Jerome drafted a single email. The subject line was stark and simple: "Urgent notice regarding voting rights review." The body of the message was brief, but it carried the weight of a guillotine blade. It read to the CEO of Kensington Dynamics: "The Board of Trustees has received concerning intelligence regarding the company's liquidity and recent ethical deviations. We are hereby suspending our automatic proxy vote effective immediately. The trust will exercise its voting rights directly at the upcoming shareholder meeting." We will be sending a representative to the gala tonight to inspect the books. Jerome hovered his finger over the enter key. He looked at me one last time, a silent question in his eyes, asking if I was truly ready to burn down the house my money had built. I nodded. He pressed the key. The email was sent. It traveled through the fiber optic cables of the city invisible and silent landing, with a digital ping on the computer in the office 30 floors above us. We put our headphones back on and waited. It took exactly 3 minutes. First there was silence, then we heard the sound of a glass shattering against a wall. Richard's voice exploded through the audio feed, shrill and unrecognizable. "What is this?" he screamed. "Who sent this? Get me the CFO on the line now." We heard the frantic tapping of a phone screen. "Who is the representative? Find out who controls Atlas. I want a name. I want a face. They cannot freeze the proxy now. The underwriters will walk if they smell even a whiff of instability." I watched the livestock ticker on Jerome's second monitor. The market is a living thing. It reacts to fear faster than thought. The rumor Jerome had planted earlier about a potential sell-off was already circulating in the back channels of Wall Street. Combined with the sudden chaotic activity radiating from the CEO's office, the stock began to twitch. It dipped 2 points, then 3. It wasn't a crash yet, but it was a tremor, a warning sign that the foundation was rotting. Richard was pacing. We could hear his heavy breathing through the microphone, his expensive leather shoes stomping on the carpet. He was yelling at his secretary, blaming her for the email as if she controlled the internet. He was unraveling. He was a man who had built his entire life on the assumption that he was the smartest person in the room. And now he realized he was alone in the dark with something much bigger than him. Then we heard the door open again. Victoria entered. She didn't scream. She didn't throw things. Her voice was ice cold, cutting through Richard's panic like a scalpel. "Stop shouting, you fool!" she hissed. "You are making us look weak. If the stock tanks Richard, we lose the estate. We lose the summer house. We lose my standing in the foundation. Fix this." Richard stammered, trying to explain the email, but Victoria cut him off. She had a plan, a desperate, reckless plan, born of pure self-preservation. "Move the timeline up," she commanded. "Forget next week. Make the gala tonight the signing event. Get the investors in the ballroom. Get them drunk on vintage champagne and lock them into binding commitments. Before the market opens tomorrow, make them sign while the music is playing and the lights are dim. We lock them in before they see the news, before this representative shows up." It was a Hail Mary pass. It was fraud on a massive scale, trapping investors into a sinking ship. But Richard agreed instantly. I heard him making the calls, his voice shifting from panic to that smooth, practiced charm. He lied to the bankers. He lied to the partners. He told them the gala was going to be a historic celebration, a night of exclusive opportunities. He was spinning a web of gold to hide the rot. I took off the headphones. I had heard enough. I knew the time and the place. I looked at Jerome. "Drop me off at Fifth Avenue," I said. Jerome looked at my grease-stained coveralls and my stubble. "You going shopping?" he asked with a dry smile. "I am going to war," I replied, "and I need a uniform." The van dropped me off in front of a small, unassuming storefront tucked between two massive designer boutiques, DeMarco's tailor shop. It was a place that smelled of chalk and steam and wool. I hadn't stepped foot inside for 40 years, not since I bought the suit for my wedding to Emily's mother. I walked in the bell above the door, chiming softly. A young assistant locked up from a counter, his nose wrinkling at my appearance, ready to tell me the delivery entrance was in the back. But then an old man stepped out from the curtain in the rear. He was bent with age, holding a measuring tape like a rosary. He squinted at me through thick glasses. "Mr. Caldwell." He rasped, his voice dusty with memory. "It has been a lifetime." I told him I needed a suit, not just any suit. I needed armor. I needed to look like a man who could buy the city block. I needed to look like the authority that Richard Kensington pretended to be. The old Tor nodded, understanding the gravity of the request, without asking a single question. He pulled down a bolt of midnight blue fabric Italian wool with a thread count that felt like water against the skin. He measured me in silence, his hands moving with a speed that defied his age. He adjusted a bespoke piece he had in the back, working the fabric, pinning and tucking, transforming the cloth to fit my frame perfectly. After the fitting, I went to the barber shop next door. I sat in the leather chair and closed my eyes as the hot towel was wrapped around my face, steaming away the grime of the courier job, steaming away the years of neglect. I felt the scrape of the straight razor against my throat, sharp and precise. I felt the weight of the beard falling away. The barber trimmed my hair, styling it back with a classic dignity that I hadn't bothered with since I was a young man. When the chair spun around, I opened my eyes and looked in the mirror. For a moment, I didn't recognize the man staring back. The stooped shoulders of the ride-share driver were gone, replaced by a straight spine. The tired eyes of the grieving widower were gone, replaced by a gaze of cold, hard steel. I stood up and dressed in the new suit. It fit like a second skin. The white shirt was crisp and starched. The silk tie was a deep crimson. I slipped on the new shoes, polished to a mirror shine. I looked at my hands. They were still calloused, still the hands of a mechanic. But now those calluses didn't look like signs of poverty. They looked like signs of strength. They looked like hands that had built things. Hands that could crush things. I adjusted my cuffs and looked at my reflection one last time. Bernard the gardener was dead. Bernard the rustic liability was a memory. The man in the mirror was the chairman of the Atlas Trust. He was the silent whale surfacing to breach. I walked out onto the street, the city lights reflecting in my eyes. I checked my watch. It was 7:30. The gala was starting. The trap was set, and I was the one holding the spring. I hailed a cab not to drive it, but to ride in the back to the Plaza Hotel, I told the driver, and step on it. I have a business to acquire. The Plaza Hotel stood against the New York night sky like a fortress of old money, illuminated by floodlights that made the limestone facade glow. Inside the grand ballroom, 500 of the wealthiest people on the East Coast were gathered under crystal chandeliers that cost more than my entire neighborhood. They were drinking vintage champagne and eating caviar, oblivious to the fact that they were standing on a financial sinkhole. On the stage, Richard Kensington stood behind a lucite podium bathed in a spotlight that washed out the fear in his eyes. He looked impeccable in his tuxedo, his hair perfectly coiffed at his smile, practiced and bright. He was speaking about ethics. He was talking about the moral obligation of industry to serve the community. He used words like integrity and transparency without choking on them. The press was there, cameras flashing, capturing his performance for the morning financial pages. He was painting a picture of a company that was robust and principled, a legacy built on trust. I watched the feed on my phone from the back of the car. It was a masterclass in deception. He was selling them a dream while picking their pockets. He talked about family values, about how Kensington Dynamics was more than a corporation. It was a promise kept from father to son. The audacity was breathtaking. He was invoking the very legacy he was actively destroying to save his own skin. He paused for dramatic effect, looking out at the crowd with moist eyes, pretending to be moved by his own lies, while his wife Victoria sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, checking the room to see who was buying the act. The car slowed to a halt. It was not my Ford. It was the lead vehicle in a convoy of 3 black Rolls-Royce Phantoms that glided to the curb with the silent grace of predators. The valet stepped back, their eyes widening at the display of raw power. This wasn't just wealth arriving. This was authority. The driver walked around and opened my door. I stepped out onto the red carpet. The night air was cool, but I didn't feel it. I felt the perfect weight of the bespoke wool suit against my shoulders. I felt the solid, reassuring click of my heels on the pavement. I adjusted my cuffs, the diamond cuff links catching the light. Jerome stepped out of the second car. He looked sharp, dangerous, his briefcase in hand like a weapon. Flanking us were 4 men in dark suits, broad-shouldered and alert. They were private security, the best money could buy men who moved with the quiet lethality of trained soldiers. We didn't look like guests, we looked like an invasion force. I walked toward the revolving brass doors. I caught my reflection in the glass. For a split second, I looked for the mechanic with the grease under his nails. He was gone. The man staring back was formidable. He was a man who owned the pavement he walked on. I walked into the lobby. The chatter of the hotel guests died down as we passed. It was the kind of silence that commands respect, the kind of silence that usually surrounded Richard. Now it belonged to me. We marched toward the double doors of the ballroom. The sound of our footsteps, a synchronized drum beat of doom. Standing guard at the entrance to the ballroom was Miller, the same head of security who had sneered at my coveralls at the loading dock just days before. The man who had sent me to the service elevator like a stray dog. He stood with his arms crossed, looking bored and imposing checking invitations with a heavy-lidded disdain. He saw us approaching, and his posture stiffened. He didn't recognize me at first. He saw the suits, the bodyguards, the aura of power. But then he looked closer. He looked at my eyes. I saw the flicker of confusion in his face, the nagging sense of familiarity. He stepped forward, holding up a hand to stop us. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice professional but firm. "This is a private gala. Invitation only." He didn't know who I was, but he knew I wasn't on his list. He was trying to do his job, trying to protect the lie inside. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I walked right up to him until I was looking down into his eyes. "Do you not recognize me, Miller?" I asked, my voice low and growly. "I delivered a package to you recently." His eyes widened. The memory clicked. The mechanic, the grease, the smell of oil. He took a step back, his face draining of color. "You?" he stammered. "You can't be here. You need to leave immediately, or I will call the police." He reached for his radio, his hand trembling. He was about to make a scene, about to try and throw me out again. Jerome stepped in between us. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a card. It wasn't a paper invitation. It was a heavy rectangle of solid gold laser etched with the Kensington crest and the words, "Atlas Trust Founding Member." He held it up to Miller's face. The light caught the gold blindingly. Miller froze. He knew what that card meant. It was a myth in the company. A legend. The card that outranked the CEO. The card that meant you didn't just attend the party. You owned the building. Miller looked from the card to me and back to the card. His arrogance evaporated, leaving only fear. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He lowered his hand from his radio. He stepped aside, his head bowing almost involuntarily. "I am sorry, sir," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I didn't know. Please proceed." The bodyguards pushed past him, opening the heavy double doors of the ballroom. The sound of applause from inside washed over us. Richard was finishing his speech, basking in the adoration of the crowd. The doors swung wide, revealing the glittering room, the sea of faces, the lie in all its glory. I stepped across the threshold. The silent whale had breached the surface, and the water was about to turn red. The silence that fell over the grand ballroom was heavier than the oak doors I had just walked through. It was not the polite hush of an audience waiting for a punchline. It was the suffocating vacuum of a room that knows something terrible is about to happen. 500 heads turned in unison. The waiters froze with their trays of champagne suspended in midair. The camera flashes stopped popping, leaving after images dancing in my eyes. I stood at the top of the short staircase leading down to the dance floor, flanked by Jerome and my security detail. I looked out at the sea of tuxedos and gowns. For months I'd felt invisible in rooms much smaller than this. I had been the ghost in the corner, the stain on the rug. But now, I was the only thing anyone could see. I felt the weight of their gazes not as pressure, but as fuel. On the stage, Richard faltered. He had been mid-sentence extolling the virtues of transparency when the door swung open. He squinted against the glare of the spotlights, trying to make out the figures standing in the entrance. At first he looked annoyed, as if a caterer had dropped a tray. Then he leaned forward over the podium, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of the back of the room. He saw the suits, he saw the size of the bodyguards, and then he saw me. He didn't recognize the bespoke Italian wool or the silk tie, but he recognized the face. He recognized the man he had dismissed in his library just 48 hours ago. His reaction was visceral. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked like a wax statue melting under the heat. He gripped the sides of the lucite podium, his knuckles turning white. He forgot the microphone was live. He forgot the investors were watching. His mask of sophisticated CEO slipped, and the panicked bully underneath clawed its way out. "Security!" he barked, his voice cracking on the high note. The sound echoed painfully through the silent room. "Get them out! Who let this old man in here?" "Where is Miller? Remove him immediately." He pointed a shaking finger at me. It was a gesture of command that had lost all its power. The crowd murmured. They looked from the frantic man on stage to the calm phalanx moving toward him. They were confused. They saw a CEO losing his mind over the arrival of an impeccably dressed, elderly gentleman. They sensed the dissonance. They smelled the fear. I began to walk. I did not rush. I descended the stairs with a slow, deliberate rhythm, my heels striking the marble floor like the ticking of a clock counting down. My bodyguards fanned out slightly, creating a wedge that forced the crowd to part. I walked through the center of the room, splitting the audience in two. I looked into the faces of the people I passed. I saw bankers I recognized from the financial news. I saw politicians. I saw the elite of New York society. They shrank back as I passed, not out of disgust, but out of instinct. They knew a predator when they saw one. I saw Preston standing near the front table. He was holding a glass of scotch halfway to his mouth, frozen. His eyes were wide, his mouth hanging slightly open. He looked at my suit. He looked at the way the light caught the fabric. He looked at the confidence in my stride. He realized in that second that the man he had mocked, the man whose boots he had laughed at, was wearing a suit that cost more than his car. He took a step back, bumping into a waiter, sending a tray of empty glasses crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot, but I didn't flinch. I didn't even look at him. He wasn't worth my attention anymore. I kept my eyes locked on Richard. He was shouting now, his voice rising in hysteria. "Why is nobody moving, security? Get this gardener off my floor. He is trespassing. He is crazy. Gardener!" The word hung in the air. It was the last insult he had left, the only weapon he knew how to use. He was trying to reduce me to my function, to my class. He was trying to make me small again. But the room wasn't buying it. You don't bring 4 armed bodyguards and a corporate attorney to a gala if you are just a gardener. I reached the foot of the stage. The stairs leading up to the podium were right there. Richard abandoned the podium and rushed to the edge of the stage, looking down at me wild-eyed. "Do not take another step, Bernie." He hissed away from the mic, but loud enough for the front row to hear. "I will ruin you. I will have you arrested. I will burn that cabin to the ground with you inside it." I stopped. I looked up at him. I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. "Burn it?" I said quietly. "I have better insurance than you do. I climbed the stairs. 1, 2, 3. Richard backed away, stumbling over his own feet. He looked around for help for his allies, for his security, but he found himself alone on an island of light. He realized with dawning horror that no one was coming to save him. I walked to the center of the stage. I stood behind the podium he had just vacated. I placed my hands on the cool plastic. I looked out at the 500 faces staring up at me. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of expensive perfume and fear. I leaned into the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I said. My voice boomed through the hall, deep and steady, resonating from the speakers in every corner of the room. I apologize for the interruption. My name is Bernard Caldwell. The name meant nothing to most of them. A few eyebrows went up, a few whispers started, but Richard let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. I turned to look at him. He was cowering near the curtain. I looked back at the audience. "You do not know me?" I continued. "You have never seen my face in the financial journals. You have never seen me ring the opening bell. For 40 years, I have been content to remain in the shadows. I have been content to watch." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "But recent events have compelled me to step into the light. You are all here because you believe in the future of Kensington Dynamics. You are here because this man," I pointed a finger at Richard, without looking at him, "has told you that this company is a legacy of integrity. He has told you that it is a sound investment." I gripped the sides of the podium. "But a company is only as sound as its ownership, and there seems to be some confusion about who actually owns the chair Richard is sitting on." Richard lunged. It was a desperate, pathetic move. He tried to grab the microphone to cut the sound. "You are lying!" he screamed. "Shut up!" "Shut up, you old fool!" My bodyguards moved instantly, but I held up a hand, stopping them. I didn't need them. I turned to Richard and caught his wrist as he reached for me. My grip was iron-forged by 50 years of turning wrenches and bending steel. He gasped in pain, his eyes bulging. I held him there, suspended in his own weakness. "I am not the one lying, Richard," I said into the mic, my voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "I am the one who paid for the suit you are wearing. I am the one who paid for the champagne you are drinking. And I am the one who is about to fire you." I shoved him back. He stumbled and fell, sitting hard on the stage floor. He looked up at me completely broken. "Jerome," I said. "Show them." Jerome was standing by the audio-visual booth at the side of the stage. He tapped a single key on his laptop. The massive LED screen behind me, which had been displaying the Kensington Dynamics logo, flickered. The image changed. It wasn't a slide deck. It wasn't a marketing video. It was a high-resolution scan of a legal document dated 1980. The header was bold and clear, Atlas Trust Certificate of Ownership. Beneath that in black and white was the breakdown of shares. Class A voting stock, 51%. And beneath that, the name of the sole beneficiary, Bernard Caldwell. The room gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the ballroom. People were squinting at the screen, whispering, pointing. But Jerome wasn't done. The image changed again. This time, it was a current bank statement for the trust, verified and time-stamped. The total assets were highlighted in red. 10,400 million. The number hung above my head like a neon sign. 10 billion. It was a number that commanded silence. It was a number that turned a gardener into a god. I watched the realization ripple through the crowd. The bankers did the math instantly. If I owned 51% and the trust was worth 10 billion, then I wasn't just a shareholder. I was the company. I was Kensington Dynamics. I looked down at the front row. Victoria Kensington was sitting there frozen in her chair. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She was looking at the screen, and then at me, and then back at the screen. Her brain was trying to reconcile the image of the rustic liability with the reality of the titan standing before her. She had spent years mocking me, belittling me, treating me like a disease, and now she realized that she had been living in my house, eating my food, spending my money. Her hand began to tremble. She was holding a crystal goblet of vintage red wine, the same wine Richard had denied me. The trembling got worse. She tried to set the glass down, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. The glass slipped. It fell in slow motion. It hit the floor and shattered. The dark red wine exploded, splashing up onto the pristine white silk of her designer gown. It looked like a gunshot wound, a spreading crimson stain on her perfect facade. She didn't move to clean it. She just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She knew. She knew about the conversation in the office. She knew about the plans for the abortion. She knew that I knew. And she knew that her life as she understood it was over. I looked back at the audience. The silence was absolute. I leaned into the mic one last time. Richard Kensington does not have the authority to sell this company, I said. He does not have the authority to launch an IPO because as of this moment, I am dissolving the board. I am firing the executive team and I am ordering a full forensic audit of every dime that has passed through this building in the last 10 years. I looked down at Richard, who was still sitting on the floor, staring up at the 10 billion figure on the screen. You wanted to erase me, Richard, I said. You wanted me to disappear. Well, I am here, and I am the only thing left. I stepped back from the podium. The feedback loop whined and died. The only sound in the room was the hum of the projector and the soft dripping of wine from Victoria's dress onto the floor. The silent whale had not just breached, it had capsized the boat, and now the sharks were coming. I looked out at the sea of stunned faces in the ballroom and knew that revealing the money was not enough. Money was a language these people understood. It was a currency they respected. Even though I had just humiliated Richard by revealing I owned him, there were still people in this room calculating how to spin this. They were thinking that maybe Richard could stay on as a figurehead. They were thinking that money cleanses all sins. I had to show them the dirt. I had to show them the blood. I had to prove that the Kensingtons were not just bad businessmen. They were bad humans. I looked over at Jerome standing in the shadows of the tech booth. He was waiting for my signal, his finger hovering over the play button again. I gave him a nearly imperceptible nod. The massive screen behind me went black. The image of the 10 billion balance vanished, leaving only a stark, terrifying void. Then the audio began. It started with a hiss of static that sounded like a snake moving through dry grass. Then Richard's voice boomed through the high-fidelity speakers, amplified to a volume that made the crystal chandeliers tremble. If the stock tanks, Richard, we lose the estate. We lose the summer house. That was Victoria. Her voice was unmistakable, sharp, and cruel. The crowd murmured, confused. They looked around trying to find the source. Then came the laughter. The cold, dry sound of Victoria mocking my daughter. She is weak, Richard. A bad investment. She lacks the killer instinct. I saw Emily standing near the edge of the stage. Her hands flew to her mouth. She recognized that voice. She recognized the words. She looked at Victoria, who was still sitting in her wine-stained dress, staring at the floor as if she could will a hole to open up and swallow her. But the recording was not done. It was just warming up. The conversation shifted to the pregnancy. The audio quality was so clear you could hear the ice clinking in their glasses. If it is a girl, we cannot afford it. We need that trust fund money. The room went deathly silent. The waiters stopped moving. The air conditioners seemed to pause. 500 people held their breath as Victoria laid out the plan. Dr. Evans is on the payroll. If the test is female, we tell her there are complications, severe deformities. We convince her to terminate. A gasp ripped through the room. It was a collective sound of horror, a physical reaction to pure evil. This was not financial fraud. This was a conspiracy to commit murder. This was a grandmother plotting to kill her own grandchild for cash flow. I looked at Emily. She wasn't crying anymore. She was screaming. It was a silent scream, her mouth open, her eyes wide with a terror so absolute it looked like madness. She clutched her stomach, instinctively protecting the life inside her from the monsters she lived with. She looked at Preston, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to scream that it was a lie. But Preston just stood there, pale and shaking. He knew, he had known, and he had done nothing. I leaned into the microphone, my voice cutting through the horror. "You heard them," I said. They were not planning a legacy. They were planning a crime. They were going to sacrifice an innocent life to pay for their private jets and their gambling debts. I pointed a finger at Preston. He flinched as if I had pointed a gun. "And you," I said, "you stood by. You let them talk about your child like it was a defective product." Preston panicked. The reality of the situation crashed down on him. He realized that this wasn't just a corporate takeover. This was the end of his life. Own. He looked at the exits. He saw the red signs glowing in the distance. He made a run for it. He shoved a waiter aside, knocking a tray of silver onto the floor with a deafening crash. He sprinted toward the side door, his tuxedo tails flapping like the wings of a desperate bird. He didn't make it 10 Fs. The side doors burst open, but it wasn't catering staff. It was a team of federal agents in windbreakers emblazoned with the letters FBI. Behind them were officers from the NYPD Economic Crimes Unit. Jerome had been busy. He had sent the forensic packet to the district attorney at the same time he sent the email to Richard. The evidence of $50 million in embezzlement and wire fraud was irrefutable. Preston skid to a halt, his eyes bulging. An agent stepped forward and grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was audible even over the murmurs of the crowd. "Preston Kensington, you are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud." Preston started sobbing. Not a manly, stoic cry, but a high-pitched wail of a child who has been caught. "Huh, Daddy?" he screamed, looking back at the stage. "Daddy, do something. Help me." But Daddy couldn't help him. Richard was still on the floor, sitting in a puddle of his own arrogance. He watched his son being dragged away, and he realized the walls were closing in. He looked up at me. He saw the man standing at the podium, the man who held the keys to his cage. He scrambled to his knees. He didn't stand up. He crawled. He crawled toward me across the stage floor, his expensive pants dragging on the wood. He reached out a hand toward my shoe. "Bernie," he croaked, his voice broken and wet. "Bernie, please, we can fix this." "You have made your point. You have the power. We understand." I looked down at him. He looked small. He looked pathetic. This was the man who had sneered at my boots. This was the man who had tried to buy my grandchild. "We are family, Bernie," he pleaded, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat on his upper lip. "Think about Emily. Think about the baby. You cannot send us to prison. You cannot destroy the family. We are all you have." The audacity was breathtaking. He was using the very family he had planned to mutilate as a shield. He was appealing to a bond he had spent years trying to sever. I stepped back, moving my foot away from his grasp, as if he were something contagious. "Family," I asked, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "You call this family?" I gestured to the screen behind me, where the audio file was still paused on the waveform of his wife planning an abortion. "You tried to erase me, Richard," I said. "You tried to buy me off with $10,000 of my own stolen money. You called me a rustic liability. You said I was a stain." I leaned down close to his face so he could see the fire in my eyes. "Do I look like a liability now, Richard?" I whispered. "Or do I look like the foreclosure?" Richard sobbed, his head dropping to his chest. He knew it was over. I stood up straight and addressed the room. I addressed the board members who were huddled in the back, terrified of being implicated. As the majority shareholder of the Atlas Trust and the sole owner of Kensington Dynamics, I am exercising my executive privilege, effective immediately. I pointed at Richard. Richard Kensington is terminated for cause. He is stripped of all titles and authority. I pointed at Victoria, who was watching the police approach her with a look of vacant shock. Victoria Kensington is removed from the board of the Charitable Foundation and banned from all company premises. I looked at the agents who were now moving onto the stage. The audit revealed $50 million in stolen funds, I said. Since the Kensingtons do not have the liquidity to repay this debt, I am seizing their assets to cover the loss. I looked down at Richard again. The estate in the Hamptons? I said the penthouse in Manhattan, the cars, the art collection, the jewelry. It is all collateral, and I am calling in the loan. Richard let out a wail of despair. No, he screamed, not the house. My father built that house. Your father built it, I said, cold as ice. And you lost it. The agents pulled Richard to his feet. He sagged in their grip, a man whose spine had been removed. They cuffed him. They marched him down the stairs past the staring crowd, past his weeping wife, past the wreckage of his life. Victoria started screaming as they cuffed her too. Do you know who I am? She shrieked. I am a Kensington. You cannot touch me. The agent didn't even blink. You have the right to remain silent, ma'am, he said, pushing her toward the exit. I suggest you use it. In 10 minutes, the stage was cleared. The Kensingtons were gone, the police were gone. The only people left on the stage were me, Jerome, and the ghost of the company that used to be. The guests were silent. They didn't know whether to applaud or run. They had come for a party and witnessed a public execution. I tapped the microphone one last time. The gala is over, I said. Please go home. The crowd dispersed quickly, murmuring and whispering, hurrying to their cars to spread the news that the Kensington Empire had fallen and a new king had risen from the ashes. I stood there for a moment watching the empty room. I felt tired. My bones ached. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, hollow sadness. I had won. I had destroyed my enemies. I had taken back what was mine. But there was no joy in it. I looked to the side of the stage. Emily was still there. She was standing alone, wrapped in her arms, shivering, as if she were freezing to death. She looked at me. Her eyes were dark holes in her pale face. She looked like a ghost. She took a step toward me, then another. She looked at the man in the bespoke suit, the man who had just commanded the FBI and dissolved a dynasty. She was trying to find her father in that stranger. I stepped down from the podium. Jerome moved to follow me, but I waved him off. This was the final transaction. This was the one that mattered most. I walked toward my daughter. I walked toward the wreckage of the only thing I had ever truly loved. The silent whale had surfaced, and the storm was over. Now, all that was left was to survey the damage and see if anything could be salvaged from the deep. The ballroom was a wasteland of shattered glass and abandoned dreams. The waiters had retreated to the kitchens, leaving the tables cluttered with half-eaten desserts and empty bottles of wine that cost more than most people earn in a week. The air conditioning hummed loudly, trying to scrub the scent of desperation from the room. I stood near the edge of the stage, my new leather shoes sticking slightly to the floor where Victoria's wine had spilled. It looked like blood under the house lights. I adjusted my cuffs, feeling the adrenaline begin to drain away, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. I was 72 years old, and I had just dismantled an empire in less than an hour. The only sound left in the room was weeping. It wasn't the polite, stifled crying of the socialites who had fled earlier. It was a raw, ugly sound. Emily was still standing where I had left her, but her legs finally gave out. She collapsed onto the marble floor, her designer dress pooling around her like a wilting flower. She looked up at me, her makeup smeared across her cheeks, her eyes red and swollen. She looked like a child who had lost her parents in a crowd. She scrambled toward me on her hands and knees, ignoring the glass shards that snagged the fabric of her skirt. She wrapped her arms around my legs, burying her face in the expensive wool of my trousers. "Daddy?" She wailed, her voice muffled and wet. "Daddy, please." "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what they were planning. They lied to me. Preston told me everything was fine. Victoria told me the trust fund was just a formality. I am a victim here too. Please don't leave me. I have nowhere to go. They are going to take everything." I looked down at the top of her head. I remembered braiding her hair when she was 6 years old, sitting on the back porch of the cabin. I remembered how she used to look at me with total trust, as if I could fix anything in the world with my toolbox. But that little girl was gone. She had been replaced by a woman who texted her husband that her father smelled like engine oil, a woman who had stood silently in a library while her father was handed a check to disappear. I didn't kick her away. I didn't yell. I reached down and firmly grasped her wrists. My hands, the hands of a mechanic, were still stronger than hers. I peeled her fingers off my leg one by one. She tried to hold on, gripping the fabric, desperate for an anchor, but I was relentless. I broke her hold and took a step back, putting a definitive distance between us. "Stand up, Emily," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was hard. It had the weight of iron. "Stand up and look at me." She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. She looked at me, searching my face for the softness that had always been there. She was looking for the dad who forgave everything, the dad who was a safety net. But that dad had died the moment I read her text messages. I did not know, she sobbed again, wringing her hands. I was just trying to be a good wife. "Stop it," I said, cutting through her excuses. "Just stop. Do not lie to me anymore. Not tonight. Not ever again." I took a step closer, forcing her to meet my gaze. "You knew Emily. Maybe you didn't know about the offshore accounts. Maybe you didn't know the exact dollar amount Preston was gambling away. But you knew who they were. You watched them treat people like garbage for years. You watched them treat me like garbage. And you didn't just watch. You joined in." She opened her mouth to protest, but I raised a hand to silence her. "I saw the texts, Emily. I saw what you wrote to Preston. You said I smelled like oil. You said you almost gagged when I hugged you. You said I was just a means to an end." Her face went white. The blood drained out of her so fast she looked like a corpse. She realized in that second that there was no way back. Her private cruelty had been exposed. "You chose money over your father." I continued, my voice shaking slightly with the pain of the truth. "You chose the appearance of wealth over the reality of love. You wanted the mansion, you wanted the status, you wanted to be a Kensington so badly that you were willing to let them erase me. You were willing to let them buy your child?" "That is not true," she whispered, but there was no conviction in it. "It is true," I said. "And now the bill is due. You wanted to live in a world where money is the only thing that matters. Well, welcome to that world. In this world, when you make a bad investment, you lose. And you, Emily, made a terrible investment. You bet against your own blood." She looked around the empty ballroom, as if searching for an exit or a savior, but there was no one. Preston was in a holding cell. Victoria was likely screaming at a lawyer. The guests were gone. She was alone. "I am pregnant," she said softly, playing her last card. "I am having your grandchild. You can't leave us on the street. You have billions now. You have to help us." I looked at her stomach. I thought about the baby growing inside her, a baby that had almost been sacrificed for a trust fund clause. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a single brass key. It wasn't a key card to a penthouse. It wasn't a key to a luxury car. It was a simple, tarnished brass key on a faded plastic ring. I took her hand and pressed the key into her palm. She looked at it confused. "This is not a check," I said. "This is a key. It is the key to the cabin." She stared at the key as if it were an alien object. "The cabin?" She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "The cabin," I confirmed. "The shack you hated. The place with the wood stove and the drafty windows. It is yours now. I transferred the deed to your name this morning. It is paid for. The taxes are paid for the next 10 years. It is a roof over your head. It is a place to sleep." But she stammered, looking from the key to me. "But you have 10 billion. You could buy me a house. You could buy me anything." "I could," I said, "but I won't. If I give you money now, Emily, you will never learn. You will just find another Preston. You will just wait for the next payout. You need to learn how to survive. You need to learn what it means to build a life, not just buy one." I stepped back, buttoning my jacket. "I am leaving, Emily. I am going to travel. I am going to see the places your mother and I always talked about. I am going to Paris. I am going to Rome. I am going to live the rest of my life for me." And the baby, she asked, tears spilling again. But this time they were tears of fear, not manipulation. "The baby will be taken care of," I said. "I have set up an educational trust for my grandchild. Jerome is the trustee. It pays for school. It pays for medical bills. It pays for college. But you cannot touch a cent of it. Not for clothes, not for cars, not for rent. That money is for the child's future, not your present." I looked at her one last time. She looked small, standing there in the ruins of her vanity, holding the key to a wooden cabin. If you want to make a life, Emily, go to the cabin plant, a garden chop, wood, learn how to work, learn how to be a mother instead of a socialite. Maybe in the silence out there you will find the part of yourself you sold to these people. Maybe you will remember who you are. I turned away. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. Harder than working double shifts. Harder than burying my wife. Walking away from my child while she cried was an agony I wouldn't wish on anyone. But I knew that if I turned back, if I wrote her a check, I would be killing her soul just as surely as the Kensingtons had tried to kill mine. I walked down the stairs of the stage and across the marble floor. My footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness. Jerome was waiting for me by the exit, holding the door open. He looked at me with a sad, understanding smile. He didn't say a word. He just nodded. I walked out into the cool New York night. The air smelled of exhaust and rain, but to me it smelled like freedom. The Rolls-Royce was waiting at the curb, the engine purring softly. The driver opened the door. I slid into the leather seat. It was comfortable. It was quiet. I looked out the window as the car pulled away. I saw Emily come out of the hotel entrance. She stood under the awning, clutching her arms around herself, clutching that brass key. She looked lost. She looked terrified. But she was alive, and she had a roof. The rest was up to her. The car merged into traffic, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and red. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The silent wail had returned to the deep. The waters were calm again. I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't lonely. I was just Bernie, and I had a plane to catch. Life taught me that money is a powerful tool but a terrible master. The Kensingtons possessed immense wealth, yet they were spiritually bankrupt. My daughter traded her dignity for a lifestyle, and the cost was her family. I didn't leave Emily that cabin to punish her, but to save her. It is the only place where she can learn that true value comes from labor, not inheritance. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone face the consequences of their choices. True wealth isn't my 10 billion. It is the peace of knowing I kept my promises. Do you think I was right to walk away from my daughter? Or should I have given her a second chance with the money? Tell me your honest opinion in the comments below. If this story of justice satisfied you, please hit like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story.